Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Friday. Hey, it's Friday. Are you looking forward to the weekend? Well, there's a lot that's happening this weekend. But first of all, let's get into the news segment for today. Well, right now it's 6 degrees and mostly sunny. Well, it was very chilly this morning when I went out on my daily walk. And even with the chill, it's always good to be out there. That's the best part of the morning. You set that right, your day goes very well. Well, right now, let's get into the news. And first of all, let's take a look at the news in brief, courtesy of ABC.
Shockwaves are being felt in Canberra this morning after further allegations were levelled at Victorian Senator David Van, who was asked to leave the Liberal Party room yesterday. Former Liberal Senator Amanda Stoker alleges Senator Van inappropriately touched her at a social gathering in Parliament 3 years ago, something Senator Van told News Corp he couldn't recall, and it's something he wouldn't do. It comes just a day after independent Senator Lydia Thorpe raised separate allegations under parliamentary privilege, which she later withdrew. Senator Van has strongly denied the claims.
It really feels like we're back to square one, and that breaks my heart because I thought we had a multi-partisan approach which agreed that the culture in this place had been really toxic and that so many staff and including MPs had been feeling unsafe.
Hundreds have gathered to honour the victims of the tragic New South Wales Hunter Valley bus crash. It claimed the lives of 10 wedding guests when a bus rolled while driving through a roundabout near the town of Greta, where residents laid flowers and paid their respects overnight. And the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has warned less water will be available for irrigators and the environment this morning. CSIRO modelling predicts up to a 30% decrease in future river inflows due to climate change. The authority will review the current basin plan and consider climate change, sustainable water limits and First Nations connections to the basin, as well as regulation changes.
So there you are, ladies and gentlemen, up to date with the news in brief, courtesy of ABC. Well, breaking news is New Zealand is officially in a recession.
I understand it is what they're calling a mild recession, but tell us what it looks like from your viewpoint in New Zealand.
Yeah, so GDP fell by 0.1%. So it's entirely possible this recession may not even survive the typical revisions that we see to GDP data. That said, the economy clearly is slowing. There's a lot of noise in the data. In fact, we suspect that if it hadn't been for some cyclone disruptions, GDP actually would have grown. And we also suspect that the weakness at the end of last year was partly related to labour shortages. So as long as that's the case and the unemployment is low and the job security is perceived to be very, very high, then you'd have to say this is not a full-blown recession insofar as the person on the street would understand it. But as you pointed out, interest rates have risen a lot very, very quickly, and certainly that is making itself felt in the likes of initially construction intentions, for example, but now it is starting to feed through to retail, to hospitality, and for the first time into services. And that is where a lot of the inflation pressure has really been centred. So I think the Reserve Bank will be pleased to see some weakening in that sector.
Yeah, of course, everything that's happening in New Zealand, Sharon, we're all looking at it very closely because we've seen those similar increases in interest rates. But in New Zealand, they were very aggressive and they were pretty early on. You know, the central bank there was one of the first to start really hiking them up. Has there been criticism that perhaps the bank went too hard, too fast?
That is some people's view. Our view, on the other hand, is actually that they will end up needing to do a little bit more. It's important to note that compared with Australia, household debt here is actually quite a lot lower. It's about 25% of GDP lower. It's still high, but yours is phenomenal. So that does mean, all else equal, the Reserve Bank here needs to do more work. We also have a higher proportion of fixed rate mortgages. So whereas the Reserve Bank of Australia can be confident if we don't get you today, we'll get you next month. For the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the concern is more that if we don't get you now, you'll fix for 3 years and we won't be able to touch you. So I think that goes a long way to explaining the urgency with which rates have been raised here. There's also been quite a different wage growth story. It's also, I think, important to note that although the Reserve Bank has raised rates very aggressively, they're not at high rates compared to New Zealand's history. So on our estimates, the Reserve Bank's going to be sucking about 10% of people's disposable income out on interest on their debt, where for comparison, that's a doubling compared to a few years ago. So that's quite sizable, but it's only 2/3 of where it peaked in the last business cycle. So while the rate of change in interest rates has been very dramatic and quite unsettling for people, it's not true that the Reserve Bank's putting an unprecedented burden on households, not at all.
Great to have your insight into it all. Sharon Zollner, Chief Economist at ANZ New Zealand. Thanks for your time this morning.
So there you go. You've had it first on Australian Indian Radio. New Zealand headed into a recession. Well, back home, let's take a look at what's happening with the Russian embassy. Well, Canberra has terminated their lease.
We are looking at, increasingly aggressive Russian behaviour. We know from earlier this year that intelligence services have been very alert to Russian espionage activities. And the war in Ukraine, the illegal and immoral, that is almost an understatement given the atrocities going on over there. These are all considerations that weigh into a decision. The sensitivity of the site, the changing of technology that enables surveillance to be done so much more easily these days. All of these things sort of compound and have led to this decision.
Well, Beck, it's interesting because in this shot that we've got of you over your right shoulder is Telstra Tower on the mountain there, and that's what was sort of coming into play here. There was a suggestion that this block of land, that they had a direct line of sight and that would enable the Russians to do whatever they might have wanted to do if that was the case.
Oh, look, there's a combination of factors that go into surveillance technologies. Distance is becoming less of an issue, line of sight. Also, there are mobile ways of collecting, of course. You can't get too close to Parliament House physically as a person or a van or a vehicle. But I think it's the issue of the particular site, and I think the government has been clear that it won't let any diplomatic mission in there now. I think that is an attempt to be even-handed about how they handle this going forward. But I think, look, it's the right decision. The government has made it on the advice of the security agencies, and we had the opportunity to make this right decision now, and they took it. So I don't think it's surprising.
Are you familiar with the actual block of land? Have you seen it yourself? Right. And what is there? Did they do any work on it? I've read that there was something of a bunker. Other reports have said there's nothing there.
Achingly slow. It looks quite decrepit. The site, it really is an eyesore. There are wire fences around. It's got overgrown grass. They've been building, I think, for more than 10 or 12 years. It's been extremely slow progress. So I think it's disingenuous for the Russians to say that they were really moving on this and that this was a major priority for them. Clearly it has not been until now.
What's the risk of backlash, or, well, they may well seek compensation, who knows, but what's the security risk here?
Oh, look, it's the same as it always is with Russia. I don't think it's increased by this decision. I think all of the actions that we're taking to support the war in Ukraine, the right actions and the right thing to do, they're all going to draw and should draw, more of a reaction from Russia, you'd think, than a decision. They've already got a mission that remains unchanged. So their diplomatic presence here is as it always was, as ours is in Moscow. That stands in stark contrast, of course, to the fact that more than 450 Russian diplomats have been expelled from missions globally because of the war in Ukraine or because of fears of espionage. So, this is not a drastic measure. This is just a good, solid decision based on intelligence.
And good decision based on evidence, and that is the way forward. So, there you go, the Russian embassy. Well, right now, looking at Tasmania, and of course, we know a lot of people go there for holidays. Is it overloaded with industries?
Every morning, trucks leave Norske Skog north of Hobart. Full of paper-making waste, they make a 20-minute drive to this farm, where the contents are unloaded and disposal is handed over to Jenkins Hire. Evenly spread and properly aerated, paper waste is great compost. But when it's stockpiled and highly odorous materials aren't allowed to dry, it becomes a problem.
The concern that has been is that that hasn't been effectively managed in the past, and that's why the EPA has needed to step in.
Jenkins Hire also operates a nearby composting pad. It accepts salmon waste and treated sewage from Taswater. A large amount of what is produced here also ends up on nearby paddocks, owned by Timothy and Susan Jenkins. Dr Fiona Beer moved nearby in 2020 and was immediately concerned by what was happening down the road.
From the inside of the house, you'd walk outside and it smelt like there was a sewage tank here.
It was also potentially had concerns about water quality, and clearly the incident that occurred in September 2020 resulted in impacts on the Plenty River.
That incident involved the alleged spilling of hazardous waste materials from Jenkins Hire into the nearby Plenty River, causing a mass fish kill. That matter is currently before the courts. Libby Cooper and her family rely on the river and draw water from it.
We have a lack of confidence in the health of the river, and as someone that grew up swimming in the river, I'm not comfortable with my children swimming in the river.
The EPA has since issued a notice to prevent waste spreading on land sloping towards the river. It is now satisfied Jenkins Hire is operating at an appropriate standard. Jenkins Hire didn't respond to our request for an interview. There are just 4 sites which process this kind of waste in Tasmania.
If any one facility is completely shut down, it actually has massive implications across other businesses, the broader community.
This is another near Interlaken in the state's Midlands, run by Barwicks and Pure Living Soil. Back in February, the EPA began an investigation after the release of liquid waste from this site onto neighbouring farmland. Afterwards, the EPA imposed a ban on this site receiving liquid waste and unmacerated fish. That ban has since been lifted, subject to conditions. The EPA said the investigation is still ongoing, and so they wouldn't release any more details. The operator of this site didn't want to speak to us. The EPA says the volume of waste has grown significantly in the past 2 decades, but treatment hasn't kept up.
The companies that produce the waste need to find adequate solutions, and they need to invest in the management of those solutions.
Trying to speak to some of the major players about waste has been frustrating. Norske Skog, Salmon Tasmania and Taswater all declined to be interviewed, as did Environment Minister Roger Jensch. The state government has plans to build 2 new organic waste facilities, one next to Norske Skog. It will be run by Barwicks, which also operates Interlaken, but no completion date has been provided. Will Murray, ABC News.
So there you go. What a lot of waste is, they reckon. But what do? Waste is waste. It's got to be managed. And if it's not managed well, it could be in far worse consequences if it's just dumped like that. Well, right now, let's look at, we were talking about the voice to Parliament and many things that are happening like that. But traditional land owners are taking the federal government to court.
We've had 2 weeks of on-country hearings which started first on the islands of Boigu, Bardu, Saibai earlier this week and have now moved to Cairns. We're hearing from some more prominent traditional owners and fishermen of the Torres Strait on their experiences with climate change and evidence that they've seen ongoing on their communities. Earlier this week on the island of Saibai, we heard from one of the lead applicants, Paul Kabai, on the effects of climate change on his island. We heard a lot about the cemetery and the damage that water inundation is causing the cemetery, which included the erosion of gravestones and the moving of sites, so some members of the community couldn't find where their relatives were buried. So there's some pretty serious stuff that's happening up there in terms of the cemetery and those kind of movements. We also learn about the effects of water inundation over the seawall and its impacts with the sewerage system there, that's causing a lot of trouble for local communities.
And there's been a considerable amount of cultural knowledge shared with the court. Kirsty, how's the community feeling about the sharing of that sacred knowledge?
Yeah, well, listening on myself, there's been a lot of candid sharing of, sacred traditions, sacred trees, sacred spaces and sites on this all of these islands, and the local community there have really shared all of this with the court, in a bid to try and save these sites. There's been a lot of cultural knowledge spoken about during these hearings. Evidence was given of the handing down of learnings like the constellations and how that's used to determine the seasons. And now with climate change, a lot of these seasons don't add up to that traditional way of their traditional calendar years, really, and how that handing down of knowledge is kind of becoming more void for the next generation. So there is that loss that they're already feeling culturally from the effects of climate change.
So what's this case hoping to achieve?
Well, Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul Kabai, the lead applicants, are suing the federal government, saying that they have an obligation to protect their lands from climate change. They want to see better emissions targets, more sustainable energy resources, and movements like that court ordered, so that the government has to put those in place. And these hearings are continuing. They're expected to go to Melbourne again at the end of this year, where we will hear from more expert evidence. The Commonwealth is saying that they're not disputing the effects of climate change on the Torres Strait, and that is happening at the moment, but they are saying that they are not responsible and they haven't breached their duty of care.
Kirsty, thank you.
Thank you.
There you go, another case of climate change and mishandling of waste and that symmetry that they're talking about. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen, up to date on Australian Indian Radio right now. As we move on, Liberal Senator kicked out of the party over that allegation.
There are different understandings of what amounts to sexual assault.
Women who have walked the corridors of Parliament House know, Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe claimed in the Senate today, that the building is not a safe place. Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins found in her Set the Standard report that 1 in 3 employees in the building in 2021 said they had been harassed. Thorpe had complained 2 years ago of being harassed by other senators, but had opted at that time not to name any alleged perpetrators. That changed yesterday afternoon, triggered, she said, by remarks made by Liberal Senator David Van in the chamber about the ongoing political controversy about Brittany Higgins.
What happened in the previous parliament does not enforce the Set the Standard report. After all, almost 2 years, it seems that nothing has been learnt and that we're in the same place we were then.
There you go, they're still in the same place where they were before, and there are a set of the things that the whole thing was sort of shelved, but then one of the senators made some remarks, and then out she comes with that note. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now let's go to this other news about, let's go outback and see what's happening there.
I'm about 30 kilometres south of the little town of Sandstone in Western Australia's Mid-West district, where there's a major police operation underway. In 2015, a man's body was found at the base of a mine shaft just a few hundred metres behind me. Raymond Kellett was here camping with his wife Jenny and a friend who was teaching them how to prospect for gold. Now, when they failed to return home, their family raised the alarm, launching a major land search by police and emergency authorities. 8 days into that search, Mr. Kellett's remains were found down this mine shaft, about 12 metres down at the base. Jenny Kellett has never been found, but in 2021, a coroner ruled that Mr. Kellett's death was a homicide and Jenny was most likely deceased. What's prompted police to return to the scene is a tip-off from the public. A family friend who's been searching the area looking for clues and trying to move the case along. He went down the mine shaft himself and located a garment, which he then handed in to police. They've tested it and say they're not sure if it's related to the case or not, but it's prompted them to come back to the scene 8 years later to perform a major excavation of the shaft. We've seen equipment that's commonly used in the West Australian mining industry being deployed here to actually excavate the bottom of the shaft. There are police officers with abseiling gear. It looks like they're sorting through the debris that they find. Now, police say they're not sure if the item that the member of the public found actually has any evidentiary basis, but they can't rule it out So they want to perform a really comprehensive search of the site again to make sure there are no clues left down in the shaft. They say it's most likely that they'll be here for a number of days.
And what a laborious task, but if you really need to get down to the nitty-gritty and find that piece of missing evidence, that's what's got to be done. Ladies and gentlemen, you are tuned into Australian Indian Radio and our daily Facebook Live segment, where we bring to you snippets of many news sourced from various sources, put together, compiled in a news format, and with running commentary with our point of view on that as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have time for you today. Right now, it's time to go to our functions and events. There you are, ladies and gentlemen, up to date on Australian Indian Radio, and looking forward to all the functions there in the weekend. We'll bring to you some updates tomorrow as well with the weekend edition, and don't forget that very soon we'll be bringing to you, talks on the yes and no of the voice to Parliament referendum, why we shouldn't be doing it, and the compelling reasons by both sides of the campaign right here on Australian Indian Radio. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, it's time to say goodbye. Until tomorrow, we'll see you.